Okay, so I've met some of you guys. I'm Jamie McCall. I live 3 kilometres down Burnside Road. What I'm presenting today is not my original work. It's a lot of other people, but my original job or training was as a journalist. So I suppose that's what I brought to this information. Just trying to find stuff out, look a bit behind the surface of it and work out for myself what's going on. Sing out if you've got any questions and tell me your name, please, as you do, so I can respond to you. I have got quite a bit of information to cover, so I'll go through it pretty fast, but if I'm going too fast, just call out, stop me and ask a question as it comes up. Don't wait for the end because you'll probably forget it. So what are we doing today? We're talking about why do we need permaculture? And I'm going to go into a bit of the history of it, which I know you guys have touched on some of these things before. So I'll probably go pretty fast with some of it because I know you've already covered it. But the context around that history is what I'm interested in, and growth and limits, and a particular study called the Limits to Growth, which was a foundational sort of text that was around at the time that permaculture was created. I'm going to talk about David Holmgren's energy descent and the possible futures. So one of the, so where did permaculture come from? We're going to go back to 1970s Tasmania, where these two guys, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, ran into each other, and they shared a concern about the future, a disillusionment with protest and negativity. This was particularly Bill Mollison's thing. He'd been involved in quite a lot of protest movements, and he got quite sick of the saying no to things, trying to stop things. And he really thought about what can we say yes to and what can we try and create instead of trying to stop things. And so they were searching for alternative approaches. So just as a bit of wider context, we're talking here about 1970 in Tasmania. So I think it's really helpful to think about things in terms of the whole of human history. So if this bottom line here on the board, if we think about that as the whole of human history, and we can argue about when that started, but there's sort of a scientific consensus, if you like, that modern humans are about 200,000 years old. So if we go 200,000 years back here, 100,000 is our halfway point, 50,000, 25,000, 12,500 years ago is probably a reasonably convenient point to say that's when agriculture started. So of all of human history, we've done agriculture for that much out of the whole lot. And then let's go, keep breaking that up. And my last little line there is 1,500 years ago. And then I've chucked that up here to the next line. So that tiny little centimetre gap there, I've blown out here. So 1,500 years ago, 750, let's just give it a date there, say 1,200. 1,200 Common Era, however you want to say it. 1,600, 1,800, 1788, the first fleet sailed to Australia. 1900, most people in Australia were still travelling by horse and cart. 1950, we had the post-World War II boom. When all our baby boomers were born, we had a baby boom, we had an economic boom. That's when growth really took off. And here's today. So we've gone from this tiny little piece of human history here, that little bit of it, this massive boom that we had post-World War II, you can't even see it on that bottom scale. So if we call, and it doesn't really matter where you draw the line, let's call that modernity, this life that we know now. It takes up this tiny, tiny fraction of our whole history as a species. So, back to 1970. So why were these two guys in 1970s rustic Tasmania worried about the future? The things that they've cited are the book Silent Spring, which was a book by a lady named Rachel Carson, written in the US, and it was basically a book about DDT. And the fact that this pesticide, herbicide, biocide, it actually killed everything, and it accumulated in the environment. And she wrote this book, and the idea of Silent Spring was we were going to have spring come, and in her climatic context, that's coming from a snowy winter into, dark, cold, lifeless, and then you have all the spring growth, and the birds and everything come back, everything gets noisy. But if we keep using DDT, we'll have a silent spring. We're not going to hear that noise. And so this was the start, really, of the environmental movement in a lot of ways, was that book. The Vietnam War was going on, ran for 20 years, and what that did was created a lot of distrust in government. So people like Bill Mollison, David Holmgren, I guess before that, and even after it to an extent, people had a lot more trust in government than they tend to today. But that Vietnam War was a real catalyst for people to go, no, I don't like the way the world's being run, my world's being run. And there was a lot of protests in the street. And then there was this thing called the Limits to Growth, which was a study published by a group called the Club of Rome. And we'll go into that in a bit more detail in a minute. So what is permaculture? You guys have heard this. Permanent agriculture, and it's sort of morphed into permanent culture. So one thing I want you to think about as you go through is what would make or is making our culture impermanent, or what is in some ways making our culture toxic to us. And if we think about just in terms of human health, we've got all these things really going in really bad directions at the moment. And have we created an environment that's harmful to our existence? And if you agree with that statement, think about whether any other animal has ever managed to do that, create an environment that's hazardous to its own existence, willfully created an environment that's hazardous to its own existence. So, and what are the characteristics of permanence? If we're talking about permanent culture, what are the characteristics? Well, I would just suggest a few here. Balance, being rooted in an ecology, a wider ecology, stability. And so have we escaped our natural origins and our natural limits in this last little piece of time? So we're going to do a little bit of maths or physics. My apologies. We're going to talk about exponential growth. What it is, why does it matter, how do we calculate it, and even when we know how to calculate it, can we really understand it? So this is a little thought experiment. Don't yell out the answer if you know it. Let everyone have a try at it. So you've got a pond on your place and you've got weed in it. And the weed doubles in size every day. And your neighbours told you, oh mate, you don't want to let that pond get covered in weed. Everything in there will die, your fish will die, and your yabbies won't be able to breathe. And he says it's going to be covered in about 30 days. So when will the pond be half full if it doubles in size every day? 15 days? Day 29. So that's exponential growth. And what exponential growth looks like is that. So who said 15? What linear growth looks like is that. So our brains are much better at understanding that than they are at understanding that. So there's a thing called doubling time. So when you grow something exponentially, yeah.
I was going to say, is it sort of like a cell, like cell growth, when you go 1, 2, and then 2 is 4, 4
Exactly.
is 8. So every time it doubles again.
That's right. So we're not growing it by a fixed amount. So when you put your money in the bank, you don't get much interest on it. But what you do get is compound interest. So when they pay your interest, the next lot of interest is on your original sum plus the interest. It's compounding. That's exponential. Arithmetic growth or linear growth is when you just keep adding the same amount every time. So with this one here, you're just adding, say, 10 units each time. to get that pattern of growth. So handy shorthand thing to remember, if you divide the percentage of annual growth into 72, it will tell you the number of years you're going to double in. So let's give some context to that. We all heard about China having double-digit growth, not in the last few years, but when it went through its real boom. So let's just say 10%. 10% into 72 gives us 7. That means the doubling time is 7 years. So when we talk about growing at 10% a year for China, that means if they do that for 10 years, they have doubled the size of everything in their society. So we're talking about GDP here, which is a measure of transactional activity, but it's a pretty good measure of how busy and how growing your society is. So that 10% growth level, double-digit growth level, means you're doubling what's going on in your country every 7 years. So even 5 years, 14 years doubling time. So let's think about it in terms of Australia. Say we had 5% growth in Australia, that means our country would double in all the things it does, all the traffic, the roads, all that activity would double in 14 years if we had 5% growth. So what does world population look like over a longer time frame? This is this sort of hockey stick graph, if you like. But it took us all of human history to get to 1 billion people in about 1800. And now we're up to 8 billion people. So present world population growth is 1% per annum. Doesn't sound like that much, but remember, it's still cumulative. So when you're coming off a base of 8 billion, that's 80 million people a year. That's about 3 times the population of Australia being added to the world year after year after year. So it only took 200 years to get from 1 billion to 7, and then another 11 years to add the next billion by 2022. So we're slowing that growth rate, but we're adding about another billion every 12 years, people. There's a lot of conflict about where that's going to go and how it's going to end, but you wonder whether the world can support 9 or 10 or even 16 billion, which is usually the highest level estimate you can get. So what's really happening with world population is pretty interesting, because that right-hand chart, or both of the charts, the black line is the UN population forecasts. So the UN is saying that population is going to stay at positive growth right up until, it's going to be growing right up until 2080. And so it's hitting a peak at 2080. But this interesting guy, whose name I've got up there, Tom Murphy, who's a physicist, he said, how are they working this out? And he looked at their charts, and it's broken down by country and by the world. And the population growth rate was falling for all of them. And he mapped all their predictions, and all their predictions for the last 10 or so years kept on coming off like that. So something was going wrong with their model, because they never got it right. So population growth has actually been falling much faster than the UN has predicted and is still predicting. And so his best estimate was that we could go into population decline as early as 2033 or maybe 2042 at the outside. So that's his blue line is what he thinks is a more accurate prediction. And in Australia, we're experiencing that too. And a few countries are ahead of us, a few countries are behind us. So the ones that are way ahead of the curve are Italy, South Korea. They're now below replacement. So they are shrinking really rapidly. And what that means is that aging populations mean less government revenue, but more expenses, because you have to look after those old people, but you haven't got the taxable workforce. Economic growth becomes harder, and then it becomes impossible. And Japan's probably the outlier here. It's been in a stagflation since 1990, and it's got probably the oldest population demographic in the world. China is below replacement level. Their one-child policy, the strict enforcement of that has pushed them demographically. So demographics are like the huge container ship. You can't turn it fast. So China's now trying to and saying, oh no, we're a 3-child now. Everyone needs to have 3. But the population's like, no, we're used to having 1. And I was an only child. Why would I want to have 3 children? Who wants to do that? So you can't just switch these things on and off. Those of you who are old enough will remember Peter Costello, the treasurer in a Liberal government. He had a baby bonus. He saw this stuff happening and said, well, we need to do something about it. It didn't work because we're below replacement rate in Australia, but we're making up the difference with immigration. Only the USA and France kept having babies that are pretty, in the Western world, kept having babies at a pretty constant rate. So instead of having a big bulge of old people and then a narrowing at the bottom, they're a bit more square. So they're the only 2 Western countries that aren't facing this problem as severely. But what it's telling you is we are going to reach peak population, and it's going to change a lot of things. But what has our population done in the meantime? So this is a little graphic of comparison of humans and their animals 10,000 years ago. And this is land and air vertebrate biomass. So animals with spines. And this is today, the comparison. So that growth has displaced nature and wilderness to that extent. So how have we managed to do that? How have we managed to overrun the planet like this? The answer is energy. So energy's allowed population to grow from 1 billion to 8 billion in the last 200 years. So energy, the first energy we used is food. I mean, we need energy to survive, and we get that energy from food. Plants get their energy from sunlight. But we grow by eating, but then we worked out we could utilize fire. So our first real external energy source is wood. We also invented slavery, and slavery would have been pretty handy when you were building a city and you needed lots of people to haul stones around and stuff. Then we found coal, oil, gas, nuclear. That's been our energy progression, if you like, our basic sources of energy. So how do we use all that energy? So using oil as an example, a barrel of oil is the equivalent of 10 years of human labor. So 1 barrel of oil, 10 years of human labor. We use 97 million of them a day. So every American has 500 fossil fuel slaves working for them. Obviously that's an average. Some people have a lot more. Other people have a lot less. But if you think about being a king in somewhere back along that time chart, well, 500 slaves was a pretty good lifestyle. And so the average Western lifestyle is subsidized by this work equivalent that's coming from oil. And remember, this is just oil. I haven't got gas and coal in here. So it takes 7.3 units of fossil fuel energy to produce 1 unit of food energy in the US. So that's what happens when you fly lettuces from one side of the country to the other, because lettuces don't have a lot of energy, but planes use an enormous amount of energy. But also you use that energy to grow the plants. And you can see in Australia, we imported $3.75 billion worth of fertilizer to export 7.7 billion worth of food. So we are a food exporter, but we grow that food by importing fossil fuel products, because all that fertilizer is made with gas. How much of this oil is left? Well, if you Google how much oil is left, Worldometer will tell you that there's 47 years left at current extraction rates. So if we don't keep extracting more, in 47 years, there will be none left. So I suggest that that means things are going to change pretty dramatically. And where will we be when we can't afford the oil and gas, or it's simply not available to keep turning it into food? We also do lots of other stuff. We race Formula One cars and burn oil, doing all sorts of fun stuff that is pretty weird when you think that it's a one-time resource and it's so amazingly valuable. 1 barrel, 10 years of human labor, and we're burning it. Yeah. So are we running out of oil? So there was this guy called Marion Hubbard, who was an oil geologist in the US, and he looked ahead and said, well, of course we're going to run out of oil. It's a finite resource. And he created this Hubbart's curve, which is just your typical bell-shaped curve of oil extraction. And he based it on oil discoveries tapering off. So he could see that the discoveries were getting fewer, further between, and smaller. So he drew that curve, and that's the reality. So he was back here in the 50s, and he drew that curve, and everyone laughed at him. Oh no, there's shitloads of this stuff. Don't worry about it. And he turned out to be right, except for fracking. And so fracking went into this tight oil. So fracking is the process of busting up rock, putting horizontal wells in, and this was what the tight oil, it was held in the rock. It wasn't like a pool, which was the conventional oil. It was held in rock, and they have to pump high pressure sand and liquids down to fracture the rock, and then the bits of oil flow down into these wells. And that has created this recent, only from 2010 on, boom in oil supply from the US. And it's made the US the world's biggest producer at this present time. And it was the world's biggest producer back in the 1970s, but it's also always been the world's biggest consumer. So even though it's the world's biggest producer now, it's exporting a little bit, but it's also importing, because oil's not oil. There's heavy oil, there's light oil, and not everyone's refinery is suitable for everyone's oil. So you need to juggle it around a bit. So this is from the Energy Information Administration, which is a US government body. And this is their chart, which says a low, medium, and high estimate of ultimate recovery of world oil reserves. So they're saying the low end is 2026, the high end is 2037, and the outer bound is 2047. So even if you've got 47 years worth of oil left, you're not going to be able to grow it without eating into, if you keep growing it, it's going to run out before that time. And that's based on 2% growth. So that's a 2% growth curve that you're seeing there. And you can see that their decline slope is pretty steep. So
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Do you know, just on the topic of what our growth is now, what's GDP, is it?
Yeah, so Australia is, I'll get to that. Yeah. So why just oil? Why did I focus on oil? Well, one thing is all these stuff readily available, information readily available on it. But it is also the crucial material to support our current modernity, this lifestyle, because it's transport. Electricity doesn't transport goods, oil does. So electricity, we generate with gas and coal. A couple of Middle Eastern countries use their oil because it happens to be there. But gas, coal, and renewables don't move stuff around for us. Oil is the most efficient way of doing that, and we've geared up our whole society to do that. So we've got a few electric cars kicking around at the moment, a lot of Teslas appearing on West Australian roads, but there are no electric trucks. They still haven't got the battery technology that makes it viable to transport stuff by truck, because the batteries are simply too heavy. So then your cargo's too light and you're not making ends meet. And you can't just fill up. You've got to charge, which takes longer, so it's less efficient. So ships and trucks move food, fertilizer, oil, coal, gas. So all those other things, oil, coal and gas that we're using for electricity, they're all dug up and moved around with oil. All the minerals products, the iron ore, it's all dug up with oil. So we're heavily dependent upon that system, and we'll have to completely change that system by the middle of this century, which is only 26 years away, because it's going to end. So, and prior to that, it's worth thinking about what that system means, because when let's think about food. So some of the areas that are now considered bread baskets of the world. So Australia's a grain exporter, but the really big grain exporters, Russia exports a lot of grain. The areas in Russia that grow the grain are so far from anywhere else that it wasn't viable to grow grain there until you had the trucks to take it out. So without the fertilizers coming in and the trucks going out, that area reverts back to its previous wilderness, back and beyond status.
Jamie, do you know what percentage of oil is used by residential cars, as opposed to, like, if you took all the cars off the road, how much extension of oil life do we get by moving product around?
I can't tell you, but I'm sure someone's worked it out. You can look it up. Okay, so what happens from here? Where does this exponential growth lead? And so the answer to that is things that can't go on forever don't. So the timing is always uncertain, but there's inevitably, we're going to have dramatic changes following exponential growth. So what does the other side look like? So this is why it matters, and this is what we're worried about, is that with exponential growth, you have this big curve up, and we've got a thing called carrying capacity. And you've probably all heard the analysis that we're using like 1.5 or 1.7 Earths at the moment. We're consuming resources at a rate well beyond our carrying capacity as people. So once you go beyond that carrying capacity, you generally start to degrade it. And so your eventual carrying capacity is going down lower. And so when you come down the other side, you're going to have to go a bit further before you get back to some sort of stability. And maybe one way of thinking about this is a natural curve like this, because nature's not static. So when I talk about stability, it's a sort of dynamic stability. So there's cycles in nature, and say that's our rabbit population, and then we have our foxes that eat rabbits, and then there's a lot of rabbits, so the fox numbers go up. The foxes eat the rabbits decline, and so you end up with a dynamic balance between those populations. And they've evolved in an environment where foxes and rabbits belong, not Australia. They've evolved to coexist, but they'll fluctuate with their populations, and populations will go up and down. And so maybe we're just doing the same thing over a longer time frame, but unfortunately we've probably degraded the carrying capacity as we've done it. And so that point where we've gone over the carrying capacity is overshoot. So overshoot inevitably results in collapse, because you're using more than the carrying capacity of your system. So, and there's not just one limit, there's multiple limits that you're going to reach. And so really it will hit different limits at different times. Another way of saying it, overshoots when growth passes sustainable limits. So have a look at a few natural systems. So these are what should have been sustainable resources. Sustainable resources because they're self-replicating. Fish breed, animals breed. An unsustainable, a finite resource is oil, iron ore, gold. They're all finite resources. There's only a certain amount of it there. A sustainable resource is one that you can keep harvesting because it keeps producing. That's North Atlantic cod landings. So the cod this is actually back to 1950, but the cod industry started earlier in sailing ships. And they used to sail from Europe across to off the US coast in the North Atlantic and handline cod, salt them, and bring them back. And there's a lot of countries in Europe that still have salt cod as like a dietary thing. Portugal is one. Salt cod's a big thing. That's a graph of the cod landings. And then that's what happened afterwards, because they just kept fishing more and more. And when they got to here in 1980, they had factory ships. So they had huge ships anchored up, the smaller fishing vessels, no longer hand lines, huge nets, bring them into the factory ship, people on the ship processing them, putting them in the freezer, and then it crashed. This is the southern right whale fishery. Whales, great for, and this is going way back, 1827 to 1850 was the big peak there. And so that was all sailing ships, under sail, guys in boats with hand harpoons. But the whale oil was so valuable that they went really hard. This little blip here, that's partly Albany. We had a whaling station down there until the mid-70s when it finally closed. And the southern right whale was their preferred whale. It's called the right whale because it was the right one, because it had really good oil recovery. So that's what happens when you overfish a natural system. Good one from Margaret River, yeast in grape juice. So here's a good example of a finite system. You've got a fermenter, you put your grapes in it, you crush your grapes down. The grapes are about 25% sugar to make wine. There's natural yeasts in there, or you can add them if you want, but the yeasts eat the sugar, and they excrete a waste product called alcohol. And so either they keep going until there's absolutely zero sugar left, or they poison themselves in their own waste before they quite finish, and then you've got a bit of residual sweetness in the juice, a little bit of leftover yeast. This was an accidental experiment on an island called St. Matthew's Island, where a bunch of reindeer got dropped off on the island, or they crossed the ice. You have to look it up if you want to know, but they got isolated on this island, and someone did a head count in 1944, there was 29. Someone went back and did another head count in the 50s, and there was 1,350 of them. And obviously no wolves on the island, no balance to the ecosystem. They got up to a peak of 6,000, and then someone went back and there was 42 left. So they overshot their carrying capacity. So how come you're not hearing this stuff from economists? If you look for it, you can find it. But how come we're not hearing it in the mainstream media? And how come all our politicians are focused on growth? And they tell us that growth is good and we should be after it. And they compete on who's going to grow the country more, who's going to grow the country better. So generally the explanation for this is that mainstream economists who call themselves neoclassical see everything as a subset of the economy, not the human economy as a subset of the world environment. And their theories also operate independently of physics. What do I mean by that? I mean they're not interested in energy. They're interested in money and how money moves around. And so energy to them is a substitutable thing. Oh, if something gets too expensive, we'll find something else to replace it. But some things are just not that easily replaced. So they model the movement of money. And interestingly, most of their theories were developed prior to the energy revolution. So Adam Smith, who's a famous historical economist, he wrote his stuff just before the invention of James Watt's steam engine. So some of these theories date back prior to our massive exploitation of energy. So if you think about it though, the economy actually runs on energy, not on money. Money is a token that we can exchange for the products of energy, but we can't create the energy. We can print money, but we can't print energy. So there's really two economies. There's the material economy, which is the real stuff. And there's the imaginary economy, which is the money that we use to mediate the exchange of that real stuff. So if there's no energy, money's not worth anything. If there's nothing to buy, money's not worth anything. So if you're on a desert island and you're shipwrecked there and a case washes up on the beach and it's full of gold or it's full of cash, what good is it to you? It's worthless. So we do, money used to be backed by gold until the 70s. Now it's backed by nothing. It's called fiat currency. It has no backing other than our trust in the governments that print it. Okay, so continuous economic growth. Maybe what we're looking at, if we run this timeline out, so this has gone from minus 6,000 to plus 10,000 there, is this spike, this fossil fueled spike of activity. So there are a few alternatives out there and a few people talking about them. Even Schumacher was back in the 70s or 80s, and he wrote a book called Economics as if People or the Planet Matter. There's a thing you might have heard of called donut economics, and we'll have a look at that in a sec. There's degrowth economics. Economists actually saying, how do we chart a path down? Because all our economics is based on continuous growth. So degrowth economics is saying, what about if we had to degrow? How would we do that? And there is people looking at this. There is quite a few physicists around, and they say only an idiot or an economist would believe in infinite growth on a finite planet. The other thing that we can move away from is gross domestic product as a measure of our well-being, because we're told that our GDP growth is a measure of our well-being, but Bhutan is the poster child for gross national happiness, and they measure that. The only problem with that is that, do you have to keep growing it every year? And like, do you get upset if it doesn't grow one year? Oh, we're not happier, you know. Well, I mean, people have invented ways of measuring it, but you've got to get out of the idea that you have to keep growing that, because you're going to hit a limit somewhere with that too.
I don't think the Bhutanese mean the same word by happiness as we do.
Yeah. No, yeah. Well, just the fact that they have an indicator like that is a demonstration it's a different culture. Okay, so we've talked about GDP growth, energy. Debt is this other weird thing that comes into play. So growth relies on continual expansion of energy use, and if you, there's plenty of people who have correlated GDP growth and energy consumption, and the correlation is almost perfect. The more you grow, the more you have to use. And people talk about decoupling. Decoupling is the idea that we can keep growing, but we can use less energy. And some Western countries say, oh, you know, we're decoupling, but they've just outsourced a whole pile of pollution and fossil fuel use to other countries. So as a world, we're not decoupling. We might be able to decouple little regions, but as a world, we haven't managed to do it. So also the thing about GDP is that it's measuring activity, not welfare. So if you have a disaster and a massive rebuilding program, that's probably good for GDP because a lot of work has to be done. If you have a mass casualty accident, the hospital is going to experience a surge in growth because it has to care for all those people. So GDP is not measuring our welfare. And JFK, John Kennedy, when he was made a very famous speech about that it measures everything. It fails to measure all the necessary stuff. It measures everything that's not necessary, but it fails to measure the necessary stuff. So debt, we borrow money today, pay it off with interest at some future date. So we can do something now that instead of having to wait to do it in 10 years' time, really handy. to buy yourself a house or a car or whatever you want to borrow money for. But the underlying assumption of debt is that the economy is going to grow, because it can't be paid off in a shrinking economy, because interest is money on top of that borrowed money that has to be found. And if the economy is shrinking, there isn't extra money around to pay off that debt. So this is what we are in. We're in a trap, because our politicians are promising us growth. And for the majority of Australians, or well, for a large portion of Australians who are carrying debt of some sort, it's essential. It's essential to them personally, because if the economy goes into recession, that means job losses, that means crashes, possibly, you know, financial losses through the stock market, possibly the property market, and people feel poorer. And so it's a debt trap that we're in. But the debt is also assuming not just growth, but there's going to be enough energy to power that growth. There's another little graphic just showing that, you know, there's the debt in the red as a percentage of the economy. If the economy gets bigger, that little slice of the pie gets smaller. It's quite manageable. But if the economy gets smaller, the slice gets bigger. So debt also creates growth. And we've seen that in our lifetimes here, because it's been done in two recent instances. We had the GFC in 2008, and we had the COVID in 2019, 20, whenever it was. And the government's reaction to both of those circumstances was to throw money at it massively. And so Australia has now had the longest period of any country ever without a recession. So we've had continual growth for, I think the last recession was the early 90s. We've had continual growth since that time. So those people my age or around about will remember the recessions in the late 80s and early 90s, and people lost their jobs. Government, you know, got embarrassed and tried to explain why it all happened. But we went through those cycles, but the government has decided now that we don't want to do that. And so when it starts looking like things are going down, they throw money at it. We are also using immigration to keep our growth going, because more people means more growth, more GDP. There's more people, there's more activity. So if your country is losing its population, you're likely to start degrowth, to start going into recession. So in order to avoid that, we ramp up the immigration in Australia. And just in the last week, if any of you, you've probably been too busy here doing stuff, but just in the last week, there's actually been a huge public discussion about this, because Australia's growth numbers are getting really low, because the Reserve Bank's put up interest rates to deal with inflation. But the way to deal with inflation is to semi-crash the economy. The government doesn't want this to happen, so they've been spending lots of money. So you've actually got two institutions competing with each other, and they both want the same outcome. They want to bring inflation down by crashing the economy, but they are desperate for it not to go into recession. So they're hoping to just touch that little point and then gently come out again. But they don't usually manage to fine-tune it that well. But we were described, and this is a couple of years old, this article, we were described as the world's first immigration economy, which meant that we were preserving growth by ramping up our immigration. So bring more people in, allowed the politicians to, even though it was costing us in lifestyle terms because we couldn't keep up with the infrastructure requirements, and now we have this housing crisis. We've got congestion in the big cities because the roads haven't been built for all these hundreds of thousands of extra people that are coming in. The houses haven't been built for them. The health system hasn't been tailored for them. So then you have to catch up with all these things. So lifestyle-wise, there's probably costs, but you can still point to that GDP and say that it's still going up. So this is global primary energy consumption by source. And so this has been stretched out a bit because it's only back to 1930 here, But if you press it in, you'll get that same exponential curve that we were looking at. So what are these ones here? Traditional biomass, wood, coal, oil, natural gas. The red line is nuclear. The blue line, the blue chunk is hydropower. And then wind, solar, modern biofuels, renewables, other is that tiny little bit at the top. So whenever you read that investment in solar and wind and everything is going through the roof, just take a little reality check that most of our energy still comes from coal, oil and natural gas. And hydropower is a bit of a ripper, but it's most of the best sites in the world are already taken because people recognise them and exploited them. So there's not much room for growth there. So final energy consumption, the share of fossil fuels was the same in 2019 as it was in 2000, 80%. So all of that green activity, putting in solar farms and wind turbines and all that stuff, it actually didn't change our fossil fuel use. It grew it. Our fossil fuel use grew over that time. So we're not replacing fossil fuels. We're just adding renewables on top. We're still growing fossil fuels and we're chucking a tiny bit of renewables on top. So the world's wealthiest 40 million people, that's the 0.5%, are responsible for 14% of lifestyle-related greenhouse gas emissions. So this is sort of harking back to that population thing. It's a double-edged thing. It's not just about population, it's about consumption too. So impact, if you like, equals population times consumption. So population's a problem, but obviously a Bangladeshi living in poverty in Bangladesh farming a bit of rice is not consuming as much as Bill Gates or Elon Musk or some of those blokes. So there's a big disparity there. Population's a problem, but some population's more problematic than others. If you're in Australia, you're well up there in those consumption levels. So if we're looking at energy scarcity coming up, there's this question, well, won't that just mean that the prices will go up and we'll have to modify things Doesn't quite work that way because oil production needs what they call a Goldilocks price. It needs to be, the price has to be high enough to make production possible. You need to pay for all of the activity that goes into production, but it also needs to be low enough to be affordable because everything we do has a component of fossil fuel in it. So this whiteboard's made of fossil fuels. It's made of minerals that were mined with fossil fuels. The tablecloth, plastic, fossil fuels. Chairs, plastic, fossil fuels. All of the timber was cut with machinery run by fossil fuels, probably cut down with a chainsaw, hauled up with a truck, all of this stuff. So everything in here has a fossil fuel component to it. And if that price of fossil fuels goes up too high, everything gets more expensive. And people have a limited capacity to soak up that increased expenditure, especially on necessities. And so the world economy can't actually cope with high fossil fuel prices. So people stop using the fuel, and then the investors stop investing in it and the price goes down again. So the fossil fuel price oscillates between a price that's high enough for the producer and a price that's affordable enough for the consumer. And a lot of commentators are suggesting that price point that price point that benefits both no longer exists. So the other problem with oil is not supply, but the cost of the supply. So a good example of this is gold in Western Australia. So the gold price has been going crazy lately, and so gold mines are opening up everywhere. But gold prices fluctuated over time, and a mine, we've got stacks of them in WA, it might have so many grams per tonne of gold in its resource. So the ones that have really low grade ore, when the price is high, they're throughputting as much as they can. When it drops below a certain point, they just can't do it anymore. It's not covering their costs. And so the financial constraints will get reached before the resource. We're not going to get every last drop of oil out of the ground because we're not going to be able to afford to. Eventually it becomes uneconomic to do some of these things. But you can also measure the cost in terms of the cost of energy. So if you think about oil, the easiest way to think about this is the low-hanging fruit on the tree. So if you have a tree that is the size of this room, and I used to grow avocados. So if I've got my picking bag around my neck, it's got a little holder here, and I'd walk around the bottom of the tree and pick avocados. That's the low-hanging fruit. Easy. I'm standing on the ground, I'm reaching just here, fill my bag up quickly, walk over to the back of the ute, empty it out, fill the next one. Then I've picked everything up to arm level. Then I've got to get the ladder. Put the ladder in, climb the ladder, get a bit more there. The last 20 avocados at the very top of the tree, they're simply not worth getting. It's too much effort to get all the way up to the top of the tree and pick those avocados. Did everyone go to Fede's place? Fede used to help me come and help pick avocados. He was much better at climbing than me. It's a bit slimmer and lighter than me, and he really loved it. So he'd often go and get a few more up there than I would, but sometimes I say, come on Fede, that's enough. We'll leave those ones, because it's literally taking 10 times longer to get the same amount of fruit up there as it was down here. So we've done the same thing with oil and every other resource. When a miner goes out, they don't go, oh, I found this really low grade deposit here. I think I'll exploit that. They go, no, I'm going to go the high grade one over here. So when oil first started getting pumped out in the 1850s, it was under pressure, came out of the ground, it had a gusher, and that was the easy oil. Now we're drilling at deep sea wells, sometimes in 3,000 meters of water and another couple of thousand meters into the ground underneath that. So now we're after the hard oil, the bitumen sands in Alberta in Canada. It's bitumen. They have to leach the oil out with steam to get it out of this bitumen stuff. So when it takes we're going to hit these energy constraints. When it takes a barrel of oil to extract a barrel of oil, extraction has to stop, because there's no benefit to anyone. So you can see as we get closer to that point, we're reaching some difficult places. And so how the hell did this happen? This is Saudi America, some people have called it. This spike here, this oil production spike from fracking. So I'm saying that's hard oil. Why did it get pulled out of the ground? Well, the US production growth was responsible for 98% of increased production. This is from 2008. 64% of US production was shale oil. It's much dirtier than conventional oil and much more expensive. So this is from Forbes magazine 2021. Despite turning America into the world's top oil-producing country, the US shale industry succeeded in alienating the investors who enabled a sustained growth. Between 2010 and 2020, the industry had negative net free cash flows of $300 billion. What that means is they spent $300 billion more than they got in. So you think, oh, that doesn't make any sense. But it makes sense for the people doing it because they got the investors to underwrite it. It didn't make sense for the investors who have been alienated, that means severely pissed off, because they did their dough. So some individual fracking companies who had the sweet spots might have made money. But as an industry, it actually got subsidized by investors to pump all that oil out. So we're already paying way more for the oil. Well, some people paid way more, helped us get that oil by paying way more than it was worth. So we're getting into really troubling times. There's a guy called Tim Morgan who has mapped for all the countries. He's from the UK, but he sees this energy cost of energy as the critical factor that's going to tip us over that peak. And he says at around 5% energy cost of energy. So that's when getting the energy costs you 5% of the value of it. He said prosperity per capita takes a downturn. And he's mapped that for most Western countries. Have a look at his site if you're interested in that, but you can see his projection there so he said that the UK went into negative prosperity territory. Prosperity fell in general terms for people in the UK from about 2004 onwards. So you might have seen there was riots in the UK recently, and I mean he's saying people who are comfortable and happy don't riot. People who are stressed and not happy with the world riot, whatever the cause of the riot. People who are comfortable don't riot. And the UK has been going backwards socially for that time because people are earning less and they know it. And so they've had Brexit and all these other things going on because they're desperately trying to work out what's wrong and see how they can fix it. But he says as that energy cost of energy just continues to spike up, it's driving up the cost of buying essentials, and discretionary spending will fall and your overall prosperity is going to decline. So one of the other things that we've built with all this energy is complexity. And you could think of complexity as the opposite of permanence and resilience, because complexity requires maintenance costs. So there's all these amazing listed heritage buildings in the UK, these enormous country mansions with hundreds of rooms, and they used to be owned by families who had legions of slaves over in the Caribbean growing sugar or tobacco farms, and they spent their wealth building these enormous country estates. And they've been handed down through the generations, and the current generation have mostly handed them over to the state, and they're owned by the National Trust in the UK, and they're now just showpieces for people to wander through. Museums, a few families have held on to them, but the maintenance costs of these places. So just imagine you're born into that family and your dad dies away and now you're Lord some such, and you have this massive mansion, and you've probably got an auntie who's been living there for all of her life who needs some spending money, and there's leaks, and the builder comes and says, yeah mate, £1 million to fix the roof. Suddenly you've got to move into the gatekeeper's cottage, and someone's going to lease your massive building and turn it into a hotel or a tourist attraction. The maintenance costs of these things. So as a society, we've got police, laws, courts, politicians, bureaucrats, roads, bridges, power networks, communications, internet. I don't know if everyone knows Bitcoin uses more energy to run than the countries of Sweden or Argentina. Bitcoin is another little added complexity. Whether you approve of it or disapprove of it, it is a power-hungry beast. People do this Bitcoin mining. It's extremely energy intensive. So these are all a maintenance drain on the economy, and eventually you overwhelm the economy with maintaining that complexity. And so if you're going to think about what parts are going to fall over first, we'll lose the unnecessary stuff first, which might be stuff we don't really need. So where's all this growth leading us? Maybe we've got some choices. Can we change course? Funnily enough, this bunch of people did a study into this called The Limits to Growth about 40 years ago. And they said, no, 50 years ago, sorry, now. Did I say 40 up there? The Limits to Growth was started by this group called the Club of Rome, which was started by an Italian industrialist who had a bit of spare cash, and he said, what happens if we keep doing what we're doing? And he wanted that question answered, so he hired these guys from MIT in the US, and they used very early computer modeling systems, and they designed this system called World 3, and they modeled population, resource consumption, food production, industrial output, and pollution. And they said, what happens if we keep doing what we're doing? And they modeled the interrelationships between those 5 factors. And the way they did that was they looked at the historical information. And so they kept playing with their model until their model generated accurately the past. And then they go, oh, right, now we can run it into the future. What happens if we keep doing what we're doing? And this was what they came up with. So this is a bit updated. They did not put any dates in the middle there. They just had 1900, 2100 there, because they said, we are not making date-specific predictions. We're just saying, what does the model tell us about what we're doing? And this is what the model told them, that basically around 2030, you were going to have a big population decline after the collapse of food services and a spike in global pollution, and followed by a collapse in industrial output and population. So that was what they called the standard run. And but they did about 20 different scenarios. And they said, oh, what if we fix this? What if we fix pollution? What if we stop using our resources so fast? What if? And what if there's more minerals than we think there are? What if we've undercounted everything? So they ran all these scenarios, but pretty much all of them ended up in collapse. And they said, technology. What if we invent amazing technologies? The technology one was interesting because it actually spiked everything up higher and then it crashed faster. So it just gave a bit of extra juice to the climb. So that they did their predictions here. This is a 2000 update by a guy at the CSIRO in Australia. So the business as usual shows general collapse about now. And there's been another really recent update, 2019, a lady called Gaia Harrington from KPMG, accounting company. She said the reality is matching the business as usual 2, which was a little bit different to that one. And that shows collapse around 2040. There was a stable world scenario. That was where they worked out the recipe to flatline everything and make it stable. And that when they put out their book, they said, well, if you want a stable world, this is what we have to do. And everyone laughed and said, nah, it's not going to happen. When the team that originally did it did an update in the 90s, I think, and they said running the model now, the stable world wasn't possible. So when they did it in the 70s, you could still get there, but we'd already started to overshoot in the 90s and they couldn't stabilize it. So that Limits to Growth was 1972, that was published. It sold millions, but it was really heavily attacked. And there's been quite a lot of subsequent books written about the misinformation about what it actually said. So this is a sort of favorite question now. Can't we just go efficient and get solar and wind powered? There's this really interesting thing called Jevons paradox. Jevons was a guy around at the start of the Industrial Revolution. And so when you develop a better coal engine at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, you think, oh, we're going to use less coal. But you don't. You use more coal because more people can afford to use the more efficient engine. So efficiency leads to more consumption. Greater consumption is necessary for growth. Lower consumption is necessary for saving the planet. So we're not going to consume our way out of trouble. We need to downsize our consumption. So you really have to test whether efficiency is actually giving you what you think. So I'm going to pick on someone. I need a volunteer. Who's got solar panels on their roof? Okay, sorry, I've forgotten your name. Reed. How much money do your solar panels save you?
I don't know, probably half the bill maybe.
Just put a ballpark on it.
Say $200 a bill.
$200 a bill, quarterly bills, so $800 a year. Yep. Or 6 weekly, maybe more. Maybe let's call it 1,000. Just round it off. So say that Reed's saving $1,000 a year. So he's become more personally. He's become more. Let's forget about whether solar panels are actually, viable. All that argument. We've got an efficiency here. We've got $800. Now what? Let's make it 1,000. What did you do with that 1,000? Just went into general expenditure. But the problem is you did something with it. So whatever you did with it, if you went on a holiday to Bali, if you went and filled your car with fuel a few times, we didn't save any energy at all. That efficiency just gave us the money to spend on something else. So we're not saving the planet. The only thing you could do with that $1,000 to save the planet would be to tear it up. That would work. Yeah. So now I told you I was going to pick on you. So I have solar panels and I have not torn up my $1,000. Okay. The world is not a perfect place, but just be aware that putting solar panels on a building is not saving the planet. It's only saving the planet if it makes you use less. But as you guys saw from that graph of energy use, we're not using less with renewables, we're using more. We're just stacking it up. And that money that millions of Australians are saving on their power bill because they chucked on rooftop solar is just fueling all sorts of other consumption. So, sorry?
We can never save the planet with technology. It all has to come back to not having any value in consuming.
We can't consume our way out of trouble. No. So basically, to save the climate, to save the climate, to stop the mass extinction, to solve all of these problems we have, we basically need to crash the world economy. And it doesn't mean powering it differently, it means powering it less. So we have to power it less. But don't hold your breath waiting for the politician telling the country they're going to crash the world economy. Okay, so energy is this critical resource which our system runs on, but probably the financial system is like the canary in the coal mine. The canaries are in the coal mine because they would die from the gas that leaked out before the miners. So it's like the early warning system. And so they had the canaries down in the mine, and when someone notices the canaries on the bottom of the cage, it's like, oh, time to get out. And that's the financial system. So if we think about Australia, and so the world is not a uniform place, and some places are going to collapse earlier than others. And if you saw what happened in Sri Lanka, ran out of money, don't have any fuel of their own, couldn't buy any fuel. Overnight, the government said, you can no longer use artificial fertilizer on farms. Farming system crashed because you can't just tell people to change overnight. They needed to bring it in slowly. Complete chaos. There's some places much more fragile than others. I think in Australia, we feed ourselves and we export food, but we import fuel, fertilizer, chemicals, and machinery to run that whole system that's transport dependent. Our greatest advantage is that we are wealthy. Australia is the 1% in global terms, in terms of wealth. But that's also our greatest problem because we're very entitled and we have great expectations for the trajectory that our life is going to take. I got preempted there. Technology has actually caused most of the problems that face us. And there's that old saying about if you keep trying to do the same thing and expect the same result, that's the definition of insanity. That technology has allowed that exploitation of fossil fuels, that massive expansion of population, green revolutions meant that 90% of the population used to be in the rural areas, only that 200 years ago. Now there's 2%. So 90% of us 200 years ago were growing food. now it's 2%. This huge shift has taken place in this really short period of time. So the other thing to think about with technology is it always comes at a cost. So, you know, we all have smartphones now, and the younger people can't imagine life without them. I know my neighbour always jokes that his daughter would rather lose an arm than her phone. And when I laugh, he goes, "No, I'm not joking." But that technology, it's come at a cost, because you can now go into it's come at a social cost, because you go into a restaurant now and you see whole families sitting around on their devices. They're not interacting with each other, with their friends in a face-to-face way. So yeah, be really careful about whether technologies are appropriate or not. This is another one that's pretty topical at the moment, because we've got an opposition party in Australia saying, hey, we're going to go nuclear, it's going to solve all our problems. There's 440 nuclear reactors in operation in the world today. 15,000 will be needed to power current power usage in the world. They last for 40 to 60 years. They take, that 6 to 12 years, there's one in the UK that's being built for 15 years or something now. It's gotten so far over budget and so far out of time. And it's going to produce the most expensive power that the UK has in its portfolio. And they take about 20 years to decommission. So at the current usage of known supplies of uranium, there's 80 years of supply. There's also a whole bunch of exotic metals that get used in reactors, and they're not believed to be available in sufficient quantities to really power it up. There's been 11 serious nuclear accidents around the world to date. And when you think there's only 440 nuclear reactors, it's a pretty good track record for stuffing up. They also need water supply and preferably distance from population. So siting is tricky. So they're not, if you did the whole 15 terawatts of power the whole globe, the uranium would last for 5 years. That's how much we've got. So it's not really a panacea for energy production. The donut economics is this fun idea that you draw a donut and you have a safe operating space. And so if we draw our donut, this is our safe operating space here. If we go outside the donut in one of a range of different areas, we're operating unsustainably. If we go inside the donut, we're not operating optimally for the welfare of the people in that economy. So if you've got a donut with all internal red, you're in the third world. If you've got a donut with external red, you're in the USA or France. The best result is Costa Rica. They have really good social programs, they have really good education, but they do it all at a pretty low level of impact. So it's a nice way of thinking about it. Is that the pointer? That's Australia up there. We're just ahead of Canada, and we're ahead of the US by the criteria of the person who did this donut economics analysis. So we're the winner on that axis of overconsumption. So what have we sort of covered? People that tell you that growth will fix it, even green growth is the problem, not the solution. More solar and wind, only if combined with degrowth, not if we keep adding it on top. Another one that's really popular is we've all got to stop eating meat and go vegetarian. It totally depends how you produce that particular food. So if you are living off soya beans that are grown in South America, well, they're clearing the rainforest to do that for you, and they're shipping it across the world, and they're using artificial fertilizers to fertilize that ground. The real answer is that you have to start looking locally in your backyard for your food supply and working out what works there. And for some people, that's going to be a diet based on very different things than for other people. And so you're not so for someone like the Inuit, they're not going to be having their pasta dishes. They're going to be hunting seal and whale and what they used to do. So there's these solutions that are really broad. We're not after broad solutions, we're after local solutions that make sense in a local system. And I think really the question is, what if we're worried about sustainability, what's the fossil fuel use in that individual system? So whatever the fossil fuel use is the critical factor, not whether it's vegetables or meat or fish or anything else. Recycling. People love recycling. They feel good when they put the recycling in the bin, in the right bin. They feel angry when they see someone put the wrong stuff in the wrong bin. The problem with recycling is that it has a cost. And so if you're going to take a whole bunch of plastic and you're going to truck it if you're all going to drive your plastic to the recycling station and jump it off, well, you've burnt fuel to get there. And then the recycling station is going to sort it with their sorting machines and everything else. Then it's going to get trucked somewhere else. Who knows where now? Because Australia's not doing a lot of recycling. China's told us we don't want it anymore. But even if there's a friend of ours runs a thing called Precious Plastics in Margaret River. And she sorts chips, bottle tops, and makes them into new products. But she makes them into new products by melting that plastic down and putting it into molds. And it uses quite high temperatures. She needs a 3-phase electrical outlet to plug into to get up to the temperatures. And she's creating quite low value products. They're bits of plastic, just more plastic. So are we going to save the planet by recycling? No, because we have to be careful what we use in the first place and make better decisions there, because recycling isn't energetically viable a lot of the time. So really we have to stop creating the waste rather than reusing it. So I think you really have to question the agenda behind initiatives like this. And so by championing recycling, it's just paying into the hands of the packaging companies who just want to keep producing the packaging that they're putting their products in, is because it's not really saving the planet. One thing we never hear a call for an end to is tourism. So tourism is a completely optional activity that causes, by some estimates, as much as 8% of global emissions. And it's completely optional. It's only undertaken by this top 10% of the world's wealthy people, the wealthiest 10% in the world. Most of the people in the world never get on an airplane, will never air travel in their whole lives. So we have this optional activity that creates enormous consumption, creates a lot of problems for a lot of Indigenous communities in poor areas who get exploited through tourism. But how come we never hear anyone saying, oh, we should stop tourism? We get told to sort our recycling into our different buckets, but we're not being told to end tourism. So I don't know, have a think about that one. So we've got climate change, we've got ongoing extinction, resource depletion, energy depletion, massive income from population and consumption. We've got this demographic change coming, whether we want it or not, an affordability crisis with this squeezing on prosperity from increasing energy costs, got high debt levels, and we've got this massive complexity and entitlement that are really difficult to unwind. So Bill here sat down with David Holmgren and thought, this is the solution, permaculture. And those are David Holmgren's definitions, which you've probably come across. But the bit I underlined there was move from being dependent consumers to becoming responsible producers. And the other things I like to think about are focus on the positives, not the negatives. So instead of we've just looked at a lot of problematic, negative stuff, but we think about solutions, positive solutions, instead of stop this, stop that. And the other thing permaculture does is defines what we do want. And the other thing is that really got hammered home. I went to a course with Bill Mollison where it was this interconnection between disciplines. Don't let people have their silos of knowledge. Find out yourself what's going on in these things and bring them all together so they all make sense together. So with that, what do we want? So this is what I think of as the permaculture essentials: clean air, clean water, clean food, sensible housing, and community. So can you limit yourselves to those things and throw away all the rest? Because that's the vision that Bill Mollison and David Holmgren had all the way back then, was that if we want to have a permanent culture, we need to work out what we actually want and need and forget about all the stuff that's irrelevant. So permaculture, it's not a belief system. You don't have to subscribe to a set of beliefs. There's no ownership of stuff. So what do I mean by that? You can't say, oh, that's a permaculture thing. In a lot of cases, you will recognize the permaculture principles in something that someone is doing. And that might be an indigenous person in the jungles in South America doing something. You go, oh, I can recognize a permaculture principle in what they're doing. But you can't go up to them and say, hey, that's permaculture, because that's what they've probably been doing for generations. It's not an academic stream, and a few academics have done permaculture type, studies and things, and they've tried to pull it in. But Bill Mollison he came from that background, and David Holmgren was studying in Launceston at the university, and they were like, no, we want this to be a grassroots thing. We don't. Academia will steal it and make it complicated and introduce jargon so no one else can understand it. They wanted it to be a non-academic thing. They didn't want a centralized organization. So Bill Mollison really developed this system of PDCs where it just got spread in this form rather than going to some sort of institution. There's no prescribed activities or forms. You don't have to have a herb spiral. It's not, and it's also not restrictive as to if you think it's matching your system, then drag it in, pull it in. So what is it? It's fact-based. What works to achieve the needs, to achieve those aims that we looked at in the last one. It's a thinking system. Put your permaculture thinking hat on. Think like a permaculturalist. That's how to approach problems. So that's really what it is to shift your mindset so you're thinking about those priorities that you should have about, is this giving me clean air, clean food, clean water, a habitable dwelling and a community? Is it meeting all those needs? So the other thing is it's very site specific and variable in application and form. So you will not see the same permaculture farm at each place you go to. You'll see completely different approaches. It's what matters is whether the thinking tools are the same. And it's not necessarily called permaculture. You'll see somebody doing something and they'll call it something else. And like I said, you don't go up to them and tell them, oh no, that's permaculture, but you'll see the permaculture principles at work. So here's permaculture versus modernity. Your permaculture egg is in your backyard, in your chicken house. Your chickens are fed on waste scraps from the kitchen. The chicken lives in open air with grass. The egg's collected on foot by the owner. And the chook lives to old age, or it's put in a pot when it's 5 or 6 years old and it doesn't lay much. CAFO, confined animal feeding operation. That's what you call a big battery hen house. It's fed on industrially farmed and transported grains and meat meal. There's this huge apparatus of activity producing that feed that ends up with that chicken. It lives inside with lighting, an artificial environment in order to prolong the laying cycle. The eggs are collected by a machine, transported to a supermarket, sold to the consumer who drives to the supermarket to get them. The bird's killed at 2 years old because that's its effective laying period. So that's permaculture thinking, that's modernity thinking. I sort of chucked this one up because these are things people have said to me over the years. Can you make money from it? It's just the wrong question. That's our current cultural paradigm where people are like, oh, how do I make money out of this? It's the wrong question for permaculture. Does it produce as much food? So I hope I've shown you that it's just a paradigm shift away from the way we do things now. So comparisons are completely meaningless. How can you compare a packet of Brazil nuts that have come all the way from Brazil in your supermarket to an avocado that you picked off your tree in your backyard? You might be able to compare the calories, but how would you even begin to calculate the inputs that went into those Brazil nuts? And how could you account for the welfare of the Brazilian people who are now in the Brazil nut collecting business, maybe to the detriment of their previous lifestyle? So I think comparisons are pretty meaningless. Where's the plan I can use on my place? And I'm going to put a food forest in. If you put a food forest in Margaret River, the 28s will eat it. You need to put all the fruit trees together and put a net over them. Otherwise, the birds will get the whole lot. But if you go to the UK, you might be able to build a nice food forest. But you're never going to find a plan. You're going to find a lot of ideas that you can apply at your own place, but you're going to have to go and find those yourself, and you're going to have to sift through them and choose the ones you want and decide what it is you're trying to achieve and what you want to get out of it. So how does it relate to other agricultural or gardening practices? So this is sort of like, is that permaculture? Is this permaculture? And you know, I'm a certified biodynamic farmer, and some of my biodynamic farming friends think permaculture is a load of crap. But I wouldn't call that to me is an optional add-on that I've done for my purposes. But I wouldn't necessarily call it permaculture. And there's some ideas there that relate. And actually it's mentioned in the Permaculture Designer's Manual. So Bill Mollison mentions a lot of stuff, but he's not really trying to appropriate it or compare it. You've got to look at all these things and work out what suits you. So the next one's the same. Is this a permaculture garden or not? Well, it might have some principles operating in it, or it might not. And it might have a lot, or it might have a few. That's what you're looking for. You're not trying to label everything pedantically. Where does permaculture fit politically? Can redneck preppers be permaculturalists? I'll leave you with that one. Okay. So I think you guys have seen some of these more recent books. So I mean, 88, the Permaculture Designer's Manual was Bill Mollison's big fat amazing effort, well worth a look at. 2002, David Holmgren brought out, this is a much more academic and cerebral, but that contains the thinking tools that he describes that you guys would have talked about. So David Holmgren is fully over this energy descent idea, and he coins the term energy descent. And what he means by that is we're reaching this peak after this exponential curve of stuff, energy, resource use, population, pollution. He's just put it all in one curve there. And so what's the future? He's put the techno explosion there. And he said, that's just for all those people who just won't shut up about it. So I'll put it in there. But if you go back to the limits to growth study, it went like that. Techno stability is another possibility, Like imagine if we actually decided which technologies were helpful, which ones were harmful. And so for instance, imagine how many billions of dollars you would free up by stopping producing armaments, and then you dedicated them into sustainability initiatives. Well, that's probably what we're looking at there. So that's the best case scenario that's never going to happen. So the black line, which you can probably barely see, is collapse. That's like, you know, apocalyptic collapse. Yep. And so what David Holmgren sees is that permaculture is a creative response to the energy descent. So we devote our resources into achieving those aims that we talked about before through permaculture. And so we're going down that energy cliff, but we're steadying it off and we're making it habitable as we go down. Sorry?
Building some swales.
Yeah, that's it, swaling our way down. Yeah. Retro Suburbia got printed in 2018. That's David Holmgren's latest work. And so that's really about suburban Australia not being a design dead end, but being a beautiful adaptation field for permaculture in an energy descent future. And if you look up his Aussie Street videos, they're quite fun. He talks about how that might unfold. The other thing that happened out of permaculture was transition. Transition towns. There's a transition Margaret River. You might be aware of transitions in your own places if you come from other places. This was really from oil dependency to local resilience. It was looking at how a town operates presently. Where does its food come from? What advantages does it have? What can it grow for itself? And trying to build people up to work their way towards that resource-constrained future and prepare for it. And a bunch of them, this is quite old, this slide, but there was a whole bunch all over the world. And they're still going. I don't know whether it's still got a lot of steam, but there's a couple of books in that. And that guy, Rob Hopkins, was a permaculture teacher who developed this transition initiative. So what can you do? Get out of debt if you can. It's probably a good idea. Build resilience into your life. Grow your own food. Have a useful job, hobby or skill. Be part of the necessary economy. Build resilience into your community. So share skills and resources. Upskill with friends. Belong to a community. Like find a place that you're going to live at and belong there. A lot of people these days, like, you know, oh yeah, I'm going to Dubai, or, you know, I've got a job in wherever. I think you're missing out on a lot if you don't build a community around yourself. Look at resources such as retro suburbia and these things that are coming out all the time. My favorite comment is collapse now and avoid the rush. That's usually attributed to a guy called John Michael Greer. So the timing is always going to be uncertain, but I hope I've convinced you change is inevitable. And this situation is a predicament, not a problem. A problem is something that has a solution. A predicament is just some place that you're stuck in and you're going to have to deal with. So it's a predicament. And don't be scared to be small and local, because that's probably the future. Gaia Harrington, who did what was her solution, was to invert the triangle of these. She had some turnarounds: energy, inequality, poverty eradication, food, female empowerment. Those were her. If someone gave her control, those were the things she would work on. And she also produced this nice little inversion here of our current fragile system where we prioritize finance, the economy, society, and nature. And we should prioritize nature, then society, then economy, then finance. So that was her neat little summary. And this is a guy, a really interesting guy. He's just released an 17 or 18 part modernity thing. He's a physicist, and he was we're going to the stars physicist. He was like, love space, love the stars. And then he started doing a lot more looking at the numbers behind things. So he has a blog called Do the Maths. And he says, so when people claim this or that, he goes and does the maths. So he did the maths on that population stuff and says, I reckon we're in for population decline earlier than the UN's telling us. So he talks about hospicing modernity. He said it's dying. So let's let it go gently. Let's look after it as it goes, as the bits we like. But it's dying, and we'll just look after it as it fades away. So, and he put 10 things that, and I've just taken a little line out to try and explain them, but he's got a sort of paragraph if you want to look him up. And this is all on the stick that you guys will get, so you don't have to take all these notes. Go easy on yourself. So read, don't worry about the solar panels, mate. Go easy on yourself. There's no tidy solutions. Okay, it's messy, it's complicated, so go easy on yourself. Let it go. Modernity is full of shiny distractions and attachments. Think about which ones you can let go, let bypass you. Walk away from stuff. So how do you spend your time? Are you spending your time on things that are achieving for you where you want to be, or are you wasting it with some of the trappings of modernity? Embrace disillusionment. Look for the upsides in losing modernity. So for me, one of the upsides of losing modernity is spending time on my knees in the veggie garden. Like, I enjoy that. To me, that's way better than sitting in front of a computer screen or doom scrolling. Accept some losses. So lose your sense of entitlement before it's taken from you. So think about some of the things that you feel you might do in the future, and maybe think about whether you really want or need to do them, whether there's something better you could do. It gets easier. There'll be more company as you go along. So double-edged brains. What he means by this is that we do have these amazing thinking apparatuses that we've evolved, and we've used them mostly to trash the place. Yeah, we've developed all that technology. We've developed all these things that we all use heedlessly. What about if we applied that intellectual power to fixing stuff, to looking after the environment? Lesser evil. Which option feeds modernity the least? So if you're feeding the beast, let's say, shall I buy the plastic item, or can I buy the equivalent that's made of timber, maybe? Which is least harmful? Which is going to get me where I want to go better? Pick a team. Team modernity or team life is his saying. So he says we all love picking teams for things and barracking for them. Well, choose your team and make it team life instead of team modernity. And regain the stuff that we've lost as a consequence of modernity. Local relationships, community. Value people for what they can contribute in a non-modernity context. So the people who get the most respect in our society are the people who do the least work and have the most wealth. And when I say the least work, I mean lawyers. I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone. Lawyers, accountants, they're highly respected professionals who sit on their backsides pushing keys. Personally, I've got a lot more respect for a plumber or an electrician who's helping us live our lives, because those are necessary jobs that are actually doing things. They're not part of the baggage that we've accumulated. And I chucked that last one in because when you're looking for what's right, I think if you look to nature, you usually find it. And so the joke is there's two things that are certain to be true: nature and professional wrestling. And the reason we know professional wrestling is true because we all agree it's fake. So we know it must be true. So it's true because we all know it's fake. So truth is out there if you look for it, but look for it in nature mostly. So Australia, we're part of the world population that needs to degrow the most. That's a hard sell. Not many people want to do it. We're also one of the world's most indebted populations. We're in the world. We're the 5th most indebted population. So the change for us is greater than people starting with less. If you're living a subsistence lifestyle, almost there, Jodie. If we're living a subsistence lifestyle somewhere, you're not going to notice changes much at all, but we're going to notice a lot. We export gas, coal and minerals, but we import oil, fertiliser, machinery. We do grow food, but not sustainably. And the loss of transport in our huge country will be really difficult. Okay, so have I convinced you? I think that this status quo or growth paradigm is impossible to sustain because no finite system can support endless growth. So change is coming, and it'll either be forced upon us or we can anticipate it and adapt to it. So the real challenge is to make our world that's worthwhile out of the change. And if you think about this timing issue, ethically it's not really relevant because regardless of where we are in that curve, putting it off is only going to make things worse because the higher it goes, generally the harder it falls. And so if we're somewhere here, got to think about ethically, do we just say, oh, I'm here for a good time, not a long time? Because we've all got descendants of some sort, whether we have our own children or not, we've got friends with children, we've got the rest of the human race. And if we keep pushing that curve as far as we can, ethically, are we doing the right thing? So I think another way of thinking about that is that you talk about a lot of indigenous cultures and they have stuff that's sacred. And so one thing that sort of almost becomes sacred in our societies is the growth thing. The way it's talked about in political discourse is this growth, 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 and it's this sort of sacred thing. But is that delivering for us? Or do we need to change our paradigm? So if someone comes to you and says, you know, you've got your favorite car that you've restored from a wreck and it's just this treasure, and some guy comes up in the car park and says, I love your car, and you do that car talk. We all know someone who this story would be appropriate to. You do that car talk and they say, I want to buy your car. You say, oh, no, it's my pride and joy. I love my car. No, I can't sell it. Well, what about if I gave you 100,000? Oh, you know, no, you know, it took me years to fix it up. 200,000. In the end, it's just a car. In the end, it's a car, and you're probably going to sell it. But if someone comes up and says, can I buy your child? The conversation doesn't start because they've crossed the line. They've crossed a line, and maybe we need to. They've crossed a sacred boundary. Like, you know, your children aren't usually for sale. So, you know, maybe we need to consider some other things sacred. Maybe these things that are going to take us safely into the future. So there's a list of sort of references there that you can have a look at later. Where do I sit? I think this energy descent is unavoidable. Timing's uncertain. I think it looks nearer term, but that could still be 20 years. Happen at different times, different speeds in different areas. Could it be happening now, and we'll look back and see it, see it further down the track. It could be slow and lumpy, or it could be a guy called Hugo Bardi talks about the Seneca cliff. The rate of increase is slow, but the road to ruin is rapid. Pulled off a quote from Seneca. So I'm transitioning my property to a low energy future, building resource for myself and the community, I hope. I participate in things like this, so it was very involved with the farmers market. So trying to create opportunities for others to participate and demonstrate. Heavily involved with this lot, the open edible gardens, which is a great thing to just get people inspired, get them out there, see what people are growing. In the meantime, don't forget to go to the beach and look after yourself and don't fall into a depression. I don't find this stuff necessarily upsetting. I think we have an inbuilt optimism bias, and lean into that and work out what you can do. So I'm participating in this conventional economy while I'm preparing myself for the future and spending the capital I can raise on long-term resilience things for my family and community. So that's the way I try and approach it. Thank you very much for listening.